In this lecture, we're looking at Charles I and the English Civil War. And to tell the story of the English Civil War, it's almost impossible to not focus our attention almost entirely on the figure of Charles I. Charles was the son of James I, the man who had come down from Scotland to found the Stuart dynasty over both Scotland and England. And we've noted on a few occasions just how important monarchy was to those living in this day and age. Not everyone agreed with the king. They wanted some checks and balances, but there had not yet arisen in Europe a real robust call for checking and balancing the king's power. There had been some ideas, sure, but none of them had talked about either going to war with the king in the sense of putting him under the boot of those who felt that they had been oppressed by the king, nor had there yet been a real robust call from, say, Parliament to stand up to tyranny for the sake of the kingdom. Those of us living in the modern world are more accustomed to seeing a pretty serious separation between the man or the woman holding an office and the office or the institution itself. Let's say in some hypothetical future time, there is a president of the United States who is discovered to have done some awful crime. Well, if he or she is removed from the office, most of us would say that this person has tarnished the office, sure, but putting them under law and putting them on trial for this hypothetical crime would be a very natural thing for us. In this day and age, it's not all that natural. The idea was always there that the king was above law. Not above law in the sense that they could do whatever they wanted in any old case. They had some checks and balances, yes. So, for example, with Parliament, the king had to call Parliament and request funds to go to war. But there had not yet arisen an idea that if the king wanted to change things, say in the church, that he did not have that prerogative. So Charles I is really the man who instigates, or at least creates the culture that gives rise to the English Civil War. And Charles really is a strange figure. At times, he seems to be really religiously indifferent. Trying to determine what his personal religion is usually a failed quest. He married a Roman Catholic on purpose. He backed Arminianism on purpose. But in every case, there doesn't seem to be any serious commitment one way or the other in terms of a theological trajectory for Charles. In many cases, his decisions are designed to really stick it to his enemies, and that's just bad leadership. Well, the context of the English Civil War is the wider political religious unrest that had gone on really since the mid-16th century, and we talked about this with the rise of the Smalkaldic League and a number of the fights there in Germany, as well as with the Huguenots and the fights in France to define the future of where the French church would go. But there were others. Notably, there was the Dutch Revolt, which we'll look at in a later lecture. All of this really culminates in the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, one of the most important and bloodiest series of battles to really come to Europe down until the First World War. All of the fights, all of the civil wars, all of the turmoil in the 17th century political context is not merely politics, though. Every single one of these fights is driven by religious, we might say, fervor, not extremism by any means. Rather, this is a day and age when Europe had not yet come to the conclusion that they were simply going to have to abide with different faiths living side by side. This was still an age when people thought that they could win by war and impose their church on top of others. Often what happened is monarchs attempted to tamp down on the infighting within their country. So, for example, in France, the Valois family over time did its best to keep a check on the amount of violence going on between Catholics and Protestants. James I, in fact, in England, did much of the same policy. In his world, though, of course, he's not so much dealing with Catholicism, though there were always Catholics remaining in England. Today, we know them as recusant Catholics, those who were forced to keep their faith really quiet and meet in covert places where they would not be seen, because increasingly there were laws in the books against, as they called it, recusancy. James, though, wanted a more tolerant policy. The English crown does not want much of this war or the upheaval to come to their territory. And actually, in the 1620s, James does his best to end the hostilities where, say, the Parliament would want nothing to do with the treaty or any type of partnership with a country that was Catholic. Well, the problem from a political standpoint is if you cut yourself off from doing business with Catholics, you really are limiting yourself significantly. France and the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and large parts of the Italian peninsula, and significant parts of all other parts of Europe, and the southern half of the Netherlands, which will eventually become Belgium, are all Catholic. To limit what is possible based on religious principles from a political standpoint was increasingly problematic. And so at the end of his life, in the 1620s, James brings to Parliament a concern that some of the recusancy laws be relaxed. Parliament will have none of it, though, and they actually double down on the recusancy laws. The context of the Civil War, though, is that just as James was dying, Parliament began to exert itself and to make overtures as to who they thought the young prince, Prince Charles, ought to marry. They issued ominous claims that he should not marry a Catholic, that he should marry someone who is Protestant. Well, again, the rule of thumb is, as soon as you tell a king what he or she can't do, they're very well going to do the opposite. Charles and James both believed that it was none of Parliament's business to tell them who he ought to marry. And Parliament was clamoring for war with Spain, one of their old Catholic enemies, who had, at the end of Elizabeth's reign, sailed the Armada up in the hopes of attacking and perhaps even taking England. And they had been defeated under Elizabeth, but the hostility remained. And Parliament wanted nothing to do with Spain, but there was actually a princess down there, the Infanta, as she is known, who was something of an ideal match for Charles, just in terms of the politics of it. Well, just to give you a little microcosm of the way this is going to work during Charles' reign, Charles doesn't want Parliament to tell him anything of what to do, certainly not who he's going to marry. But he's also a bit gun-shy, you might say. He's a bit unwilling to really stand tall and tell Parliament what he's going to do. So what does Charles do? He secretly heads off to Spain to try to find himself a wife. Now it comes to no end, but he travels back and no one in England really knows what he had done. He then, however, turns to France and does a similar move. He ends up marrying Henrietta Maria, the French princess, and the daughter of Henry IV. And you'll recall that Henry IV is the man who said that Paris is worth a mass. He had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism when he took the throne. Well, again, Charles seems to speak out of both sides of his mouth. In the marriage negotiations with France, he promises to relax the laws against recusancy or against covert Catholic practice in England. He then comes back to Parliament and tells them that he's going to marry Henrietta Maria, but that he's not going to relax these laws. He's also promised the French crown that he will supply English ships in their efforts to secure their borders and their coastal towns. And there's a very famous battle, the taking of La Rochelle. This is a Huguenot town, and the crown did not like that the Huguenots had taken over, and so they were going to bombard it and take it back. Charles had promised ships and fleet to go down there to be at service for the crown, but he knew immediately, as soon as he got back to England, that he had put forward English ships to assault the Huguenots, that there was going to be an uprising, at least metaphorically speaking, significant hostility towards him. And so in the last minute, he sends his own ships down there to protect La Rochelle, and it's to no avail, and it fails. So now he's simultaneously made Parliament and the French king unhappy. Still, though, he marries Henrietta Maria, and to the day he died, no one trusted him religiously for this. The last thing politically is Charles and Parliament go back and forth over the issue of what's known as poundage and taxation. There were lots of liberties that Charles began to take in terms of how he accrued money from the taxation base there in England. By and large, the king had to ask Parliament for certain rights to tax certain things. Charles didn't like that, and at times he sort of went his own way and increased certain taxations and certain policies here and there. All the way until the beginning of the English Civil War, they're going back and forth on this. But don't say this as merely an issue of taxation, because the issue of taxation has at its root the issue of the king's decision repeatedly to do whatever he wants without any type of collaboration with the Parliament or with the normal governing structures within England. You might say that Charles was an intensified version of his father. James talked incessantly about his own right and his own power, but James knew how to rule. He knew how to balance different sides against themselves and how not to hack off all the wrong people while doing so. Charles is not blessed with that type of grace. Well, that politics, that back and forth between Parliament and the king, forms again the backdrop or the conditioning, you might say, of the religious fight that goes on during the English Civil War. A select number of people in England were getting a bit tired of Puritanism. They were tired of it not so much because they differed with it theologically all this time. As we've seen repeatedly, often they had the same theological principles, just different applications as to how the Reformed faith or the traditional Protestant faith was to live itself out in the context of the English church. Well, as alternatives to Reformed theology or wider Protestantism begin to emerge, a number of people begin to leverage this against the generic Puritan ethos there in England. So during this time, in the early 1600s, there were a number of people who began to question and to doubt some of the basic principles of Protestant theology, namely some of the ideas associated with the doctrine of predestination. We'll look at this in a later lecture, but it is during this time that Arminianism comes on the rise in the Netherlands. Well, it doesn't simply affect the Netherlands. In fact, the move away from more traditional Protestant doctrines begins to happen in England as well. A man by the name of Richard Montague was pretty viscerally opposed to the Puritan ethos. And he ended up writing a couple of books in which he argued that Anglicanism, or the Church of England, was not based on a traditional reading of Protestant doctrines, and it certainly wasn't, in his mind, anywhere close to Reformed theology. In other words, Richard Montague is a revisionist. He goes back and he pretends as if all the long heritage from Cranmer on, this long interaction between all the various early Protestants as it evolved in Europe as a whole, Montague sees this as not the genealogy that he wants to see in his own church. And so he thinks, another one. One of the books he wrote was called A New Gag for an Old Goose in 1624. And another work he wrote, a very famous one, was called the Appello. In both of these works, as well as in others, Richard Montague does a couple of different moves. First and foremost, he mocks Reformed theology and the Synod of Dort. He says this idea of predestination or any of these other doctrines are cold and calculating and not biblical teaching. He also then argues that the English church's theology, he doesn't call it Anglicanism because that's not a word yet that's being used, but the English church's theology, the official state church's theology, is not Protestant, it's more ancient. He argues that their church is more in keeping, you might say, with the patristic witness. And therefore, it's more about liturgy and about more of the traditional elements of the Christian life. Montague, in other words, is either a bad theologian or a bad historian. You see, because while his ideas might have appeal for some, then and now, this argument that Anglicanism had no real role to play and no real resources from Protestantism, and that it is just some genealogy from the patristic and medieval world, is simply made up out of thin air. And just to show this, the Commons there in London actually had Montague arrested. They arrested him for slandering the church and for slandering James, King James, who had now passed on. Some people scratch their head about this, but you have to remember James had been trained by this real robust Reformed Protestantism. And this heady attack on the way things had been up until their day was just not to be tolerated. Now, this is in part those in Commons who are themselves Puritan, let's say, using the political might to put the man down. However, at this point, Charles himself steps in. Once Montague is able sufficiently to release himself and to convince others that he is not Arminian fully, then Charles makes him actually a court chaplain there for himself. Now, the way Montague had convinced people is he wrote a preface to the 39 articles, the confessional standards there in the 17th century, as well as to the Book of Common Prayer, in which he argued that he did not intend to mean that he was Arminian. You see, because Arminianism had been thoroughly bashed, both in the Netherlands and to the applause of those in England. Many people found early Arminianism to be not the best ideas. A lot of this is aversion to Catholic talk of merit and good works, but there's also a political edge to a lot of this. So Montague would convince everyone that he's not an Arminian, which is probably true on some level. He doesn't seem to have really read Arminianism. His main argument was that Anglicanism was ancient and not really Protestant. But the important thing here is Charles backs him, supports him, and then hires him. It's from that real move that you see a lot of these elements begin to happen in the run-up to the English Civil War. I mentioned in our lecture on Puritanism that there was a group called the Caroline Divines. Well, this is the time when this begins to arise. William Laud, the Archbishop eventually of Canterbury, and a number of others began to write in a similar vein to Richard Montague on behalf of the king. So as the king is butting heads with a predominantly Puritan parliament, you have a group of people who theologically also want to help fight the king's battles by taking out this Puritan voice. So again, notice the back and forth between issues of taxation and the king's prerogative to do whatever he wants without having to request anything of Parliament syncs up perfectly with an ongoing Puritan fight to define the English church in the more, let's say, Elizabethan ways. You see, because under Elizabeth, everyone knew that they had relatively the same theology. They were just arguing over what direction that theology would take them. Even if you count some of the variety of different theologies there under Elizabeth, from an actual theological standpoint, the variety is not all that great. It's still essentially overwhelmingly Protestant. You don't have widespread difference on the views of the sacraments. You don't have widespread issues on the use of traditional understandings of law, gospel, of predestination, etc. No one fought over those issues under Elizabeth. They were fighting over vestments, crucifixes, again, more cultural things. And they were important fights. What's happening now, though, is there's a shift theologically. To now there are alternatives to the traditional understanding of Anglican Protestant theology. Again, I don't want to make it too hard of a distinction here, but you have to see that what's happening here under Charles is both driven by Charles because he's supporting it and he's opposed to these Puritans, but it's also being driven by new voices who are alleging new theology but disguising it as the, quote, way things have always been. Well, the progress from these circumstances to the Civil War happened quite rapidly. But again, I hope you see that what is going on here is both political, both about taxation and the king's prerogative, and still about theology. In one of the more somewhat hilarious moments, in 1629, there was called a parliament. The king brought them together to ask for taxation to help achieve some of the king's goals. The problem is once Parliament was called, they began to fight incessantly about taxation and religion, believe it or not, both at the same time. The king's prerogative and what's all this talk going on around about how we are no longer Protestant, about how we'd always been some sort of patristic medieval thing. And as it happened, the king tried to dismiss Parliament, and he calls on the speaker, John Finch, to gavel it down and to end Parliament. But given at least a letter of the law, several men tie Finch down so that he is unable to gavel the meeting to a close. They then turn around and say, any more business? And of course, there's no gavel, so they carry on. And they issue what's known as the 3 resolutions. Now notice these 3. First, they issue a resolution from Parliament that the taxes levied by the king repeatedly are illegal. Secondly, they issued an anti-Catholic resolution that England was going to continue its policy of recusancy laws, oppressing and suppressing Catholicism. Thirdly, and importantly, Parliament itself issues here an anti-Arminian resolution. The fight, in other words, has got to the point that they see the taxation issue with the king as synonymous with his attempt to redefine the church either along Arminian lines or along Catholic lines. Now, Charles has the perpetrators of this imprisoned, but it does form a microcosm, again, of what's going on here. There is, let's just say, parliamentarian resistance to the king's decisions and to the men that he is backing, both in terms of the government and in terms of the church. Well, the story itself of the English Civil War is pretty well known, but not usually in the American context at least. In an effort to stabilize some of Charles' opinions about the church, in 1633, William Laud is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Laud usually gets blamed for all kinds of things, More historians tend to believe that Charles is backing and in some ways pushing these changes. Well, one of the changes made actually was up in Scotland. This choice actually is what caused and provoked the initial stages of the English Civil War. You see, because Charles looked up at Scotland and he realized that he, as King of Scotland as well as England, needed to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the church up there. In a manner of speaking, he realized that the Reformed Protestant bastion was just as pronounced up in Scotland as it was down in England, and he was ready to have none of it. And so what he decided was that he was going to impose the Book of Common Prayer. Not only that, though, he went back to the 1549 version of the Book of Common Prayer, the one that was only a piecemeal step towards Protestantism by Cranmer under Edward. It's still certainly Protestant in most ways, but it's going a step back liturgically, let's say. Well, if you know anything about the Scottish, they are not about to put up with this. And in fact, there's a very famous church in Edinburgh, up on the top of Castle Mount, where a very famous woman, Jane Geddes, sitting on a stool down in the front row, listening to the service. As it began, the priest began the liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer, and Jane, not having any of it, threw the stool at the priest. In some ways, it's, the poor guy, he's just doing his job. But this is, you might say, the stool thrown around the world. This propels a real serious rebellion amongst the Scottish. They are having none of this. Charles decides that he's not going to ask Parliament for money to go to war against Scotland for this action. He knows that Parliament will actually side with Scotland for the decision. So in 1639, Charles goes to war by himself. It's a war called the Bishops' War, and it fails. So Charles is forced in 1640 to call Parliament to ask for the funds to go up to Scotland to recover the lands and to impose order. At which time, Parliament said, no, we're going to talk about some of these ongoing issues and problems. And we actually see why Scotland has done this, and we are not going to give you any money. At which point, Charles says, well, then you're dismissed. And Parliament actually says, no, we're not. And so Parliament, though being dismissed, refuses to gavel themselves closed. And so from 1640 begins what is known as the Long Parliament. It's year after year after year where Parliament does not close their session. Now, they're not sitting in the meeting hall 24/7, but it's the idea that they will not cease to meet because if they close, they need to wait for a summonings by the king before they can have another meeting. In this case, they just refuse to close the books. They don't gavel anything down and they stay open. Progressing from this, you eventually have the explosion of civil war. The king essentially wants Parliament to stop. Parliament does not, and eventually you have a splitting of two different armies. The parliamentarians, obviously, on the one side, and the royalists, those who back Charles, on the other. Now, these two sides go by two different names. The parliamentarians are often known as the Roundheads, and the royalists are known as the Cavaliers. I won't go into all the ins and outs of the Civil War for the sake of time, but there are a couple of features to it that need to be marked. First is that Charles is eventually captured, and in 1649, very famously, though it took them some time after his capture to come to this conclusion, he was eventually put on trial by the Parliament, and he was found guilty of treason, and then in 1649, he was beheaded. So first and foremost is that the king is killed. Regicide happens here in the midst of the English Civil War. For at least a generation, in fact, then, there is no king on the throne. They go first from being a republic, the idea here being that they're going to try to put some sort of democracy in place, and then after that fails, they move to being a protectorate, where the man Oliver Cromwell, the very famous man whose statue still stands outside of Parliament today, became protector of the kingdom and who ruled it almost de facto himself as a king, though he would never have called himself this. So the politics are very pregnant, you might say. Parliament has asserted itself, it has won, and it has cut the king's head off. And not only that, but they have sent Charles I's son, the man who would be Charles II, off into exile. The last thing, though, again, partnering up this issue of politics and religion, It is during the context of the English Civil War, and after they have captured Charles, that you see called the Westminster Assembly, one of the more important assemblies and one of the more important documents that is ever created for the Protestant faith. This is, the 17th century is, as we've said, the confessional age. It's the age of real serious, robust, confessional documents that are being created. Well, the Westminster Standards, as they're called, comes right here in the middle of the English Civil War. Once the king had been deposed, Parliament called for learned divines, as they called them, which is another way of saying theologians and churchmen, to come together and to create officially a serious and clear body of doctrine and practice that they were going to embrace as the English Church. And the Westminster Standards include the Westminster Confession of Faith, a confession that is still embraced by a number of denominations today, particularly the Presbyterian Church, as well as the larger and shorter catechisms, which are a series of questions and answers for those who need substantive analysis or exploration of the faith. The shorter catechism is for everyday people, it's for lay folks, and in particular, it's for children. The larger catechism is, you might say, for the seminarian or those training for pastoral ministry. Now, it's not often appreciated the extent to which the Westminster Standards were wrapped up in this tumultuous day and age with the English Civil War. But it does explain both its punch, its length, and the fact that it was later rejected by the King of England. You see, because the importance of it comes out of this turmoil, and it is so long and so detailed, in part because for the very first time, these divines, these theologians, had the ability to really create something special and something in-depth. They weren't going to simply come up with a short confessional statement of several points about their faith. They wanted to finally, fully vocalize the grammar of the English Church. But, as you can imagine, when Charles II comes back, these standards, these documents, having come from the context in which his father was beheaded, were eventually rejected. And not only that, but they further widened the divide between the Puritan Reformed world and those within the English Church, who began increasingly to find Reformed theology to be suspect in their midst.